Hey everyone, it's Paul at the library, and today's program is about archaeology in Hot Springs National Park. And our guest presenter is Victoria Reichard, who's the park archaeologist for Hot Springs National Park, where she's responsible for identifying, recording, and protecting the park's numerous archaeological sites. She holds bachelor's degrees in Anthropology and Archaeology from the University of Virginia and a master's degree from Wheaton College. And she's worked on a variety of archaeological projects in 15 states domestically, as well as some abroad. And when she's not working, she enjoys hiking, antiquing, and spending time with her husband, Joe, and their 2 dogs. So, Victoria, thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. Let's get this.
And before we begin, since we've had some back and forth, like I told you earlier, can you explain when the word archaeology has that extra A and when it doesn't?
Absolutely. That is an ongoing debate, and every archaeologist has an opinion. But for the federal government, at least in the U.S., the archaeology is usually spelled without the extra A. So that's how I spell it here.
Fair enough. All right, are you ready to start your PowerPoint?
I'm ready when you are.
All right, loading it up.
All right. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for having me today. As Paul said, my name is Victoria Reichard, and I am the park archaeologist for Hot Springs National Park. I'm here today to talk to you about what that actually means. So, as we get started here, what is archaeology? Archaeology is defined as the study of material culture. That means that we're looking at stuff to understand the daily lives of people in the past and history as a whole. We're looking at things like artifacts, structural remains, hearths, food remains, hunting traps, quarries, anything and everything made or used by people. We're basically looking at all of these things like lines of evidence that we find like a big puzzle that we just need to put back together. Unfortunately, we don't usually deal with dinosaurs. That's a big misconception. The only exception would be if we found some fossils in the context of human activity, but even then we would just call a paleontologist. For our purposes as a federal land management agency, that being the Park Service, we consider anything 50 years old or older to be archaeology. That number comes from the National Historic Preservation Act, so it's more or less an industry standard. I think, as you can see, it's pretty safe to say that archaeology isn't as glamorous as Indiana Jones makes it out to be, but we have fun anyway. So let's start at the beginning. How do we know where to look for sites? There are a lot of different ways. So one thing that we use is a technique called predictive modeling. Basically, we're looking at different factors to figure out where on a landscape people would have been most likely to live or work. Those characteristics that we're looking for, we pick out by looking at other sites in the region. So if we have 50 known sites in a region and we have 4 characteristics at all of those sites, we know that those are things that people were looking for. So this is an actual NPS model from Alaska that somebody created. The modelers in this case were looking for sites that are near a water source, on flat ground, that have exposure to the southern sky, and are in a well-drained area. So they plugged all of those factors into a GIS program and ended up with these red areas as their places to look. So the characteristics that we're looking for are going to change depending on where you are and what kind of site you're looking for. If you're interested in novaculite quarries, for example, you're going to care more about the location of novaculite outcrops than you are about access to water. You can't have a quarry if there's no novaculite. Sometimes we also get reports from people who either have found something or knows where something is. That could be somebody who is out hiking and stumbles across something. It could be someone who says, hey, my great-grandpappy lived up on that hill as a kid, and he said X, Y, and Z is up by that weird-looking rock. That's probably a good place to start. It also could be something like this 1890s railway berm that was reported to the park up on West Mountain. So the park knew that there had been a railway plan there, but they also knew it hadn't been completed and just kind of assumed that it hadn't really been started. And then somebody brought it to our attention. So our first stop was our archives and some old maps, which really give us great information. I actually just recorded a site last week that I had found on a different old map while looking for something else entirely. So they're really a great place to start if you're looking for historic sites. This is an 1895 map section. And as you can see in this red box, there is a railway mapped on this mountain. However, it's mapped along with an observatory and a casino that we know for a fact were not built. So this was probably a little bit of wishful thinking at this point. Our next stop are what are called digital elevation models. So I'm sure some of you have heard of LiDAR. If we were here in person, I would ask for a show of hands, but we're not. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's basically a way to use beams of light to get a detailed map of a surface, in this case, the ground surface. So the way this actually works is that somebody with a very specialized set of skills takes some equipment up in a plane and it shoots beams of light at the ground that can penetrate through a tree canopy. And then it measures how long it takes those beams to bounce back up. And it gives you this series of points that you can then take and extrapolate into something like you see on the screen here. So this is one type of something that's called remote sensing, which basically just means it's a way to look at something without actually physically being there. So that big category also includes things like analyzing satellite imagery. So we know from the archival records that this railway was never completed, but we can see in this digital elevation model that there was a fair amount of work done. So you can see some roads here. You can maybe see a hiking trail down here. And then in this black box, you'll see this weird looking feature going up the side of the mountain. That's our actual railway berm right there. The last step is to actually ground truth it. Oh no, I don't know why this picture is so blurry. All right, something went wrong in importing this, but if this weren't so blurry, you would be able to see the actual berm in this photo. So all of these are ways that we can find sites, and all of these are ways that I occasionally do find sites. But most of the work I actually end up doing for the park is tied to other projects in the park, things like construction work, trail work, things like that. There's a really important section in the National Historic Preservation Act called Section 106 that basically just says any project done on federal land or with federal money has to protect important historic and archaeological resources, which is pretty straightforward. Makes sense. But how do we know what's there? We can't protect it if we don't know it's there. And for that, we do some survey work. We do survey work for other reasons as well. Sometimes if we're just curious, sometimes if there are other things going. But this is really a big driver for archaeology within most of the federal government. So there's a couple different ways we can do these surveys. The first is shovel testing, which, as you may guess, is done by digging a hole with a shovel. Basically, we set up a grid pattern across the area we're looking at, and we dig holes that are about 1.5 feet across and about 3 feet deep if we can get that deep. And this is just a really quick and dirty way to look at what's there. It's not going to be as meticulous and detailed as a big excavation unit. It's really just a snapshot. So we would record things like changes in the soil, what kind of artifacts we find, take a GPS point, take some photos, and fill it back in. And sometimes this means I am digging a lot of empty holes and then filling them back in. We also do a type of survey called Pedestrian Survey. And with this kind of survey, we are digging no holes at all. With this type of survey, we are only looking at what's on the surface. And we would do this in areas where there's not a lot of soil deposition, so most things are still on the surface, areas where there's really good ground visibility, or in the case where it's just too dangerous to be digging for some reason, whether that means that we don't know where the electric lines are running through that area, whether it's too steep and somebody would end up falling down a hill. It's just, safety first. So for this kind of survey, we literally walk in straight lines back and forth across the area. It's methodical. We cover the area really well, but again, it's only the surface. And those lines are going to be spaced about 10 to 15 meters apart usually. So if we find anything 50 years old or older, we would take a GPS point, some photos, take some notes, and then we would move on. All right, so we've identified our sites, but what's next? In a lot of cases, nothing. We will fill out some documentation based on what we know and leave them buried. Some places we only record what's on the surface. If these are tied to other projects within the park, we may recommend adjusting that project a little bit. We may say you need to have an archaeologist on site because we're not sure if there's something important here. Or we may say you can't do that project at all. It's going to destroy something. In very rare cases in the Park Service, we'll do some actual excavation. And this is a very minuscule part of what we actually do. But this is probably what most of you are thinking of when we're talking about archaeology. So this could be anything from a 1 by 1 meter unit, a single one, to huge, full-blown, large-scale grids. Excavation, while it gives us the best information of any of these different methods, is very expensive and very time-consuming. You need a lot of people, you're moving slowly. It just takes a while. It also will expose your site to the air, which doesn't sound like it should be that big of a deal, but some kinds of artifacts are best preserved when they're buried. So if you're going to start an excavation, you need to make sure that you have the time to do it well, and you need to make sure that you are ready to preserve whatever you pull up. So these are photos from an excavation done on Arlington Lawn. Our maintenance workers actually stumbled across this brick thing that you see here. This is a foundation pier from one of the Arlington hotels that used to stand on that site. Sometimes we call in help and do what's called a geophysical survey. So a lot of you, again, have probably heard of ground penetrating radar. Geophysical surveys include that and then a couple other methods that do similar things, but using different methods. So you may have, instead of radar, looking at electrical resistance. You may be looking at the magnetic field and changes in that. It's less intrusive, but it's limited. So usually this kind of goes hand in hand with excavation. So when you do your geophysical survey, you're going to get a map that looks something like this. This is actually from a cemetery within the park, and this was a magnetometer survey. So you can see that there are places where you're getting those really bright spots where something is different. So we wouldn't actually excavate a cemetery, but if this were, say, a bathhouse lawn, and I were looking for where I wanted to put in 3 excavation units, I would have a good place to start at least. So all of this work that we're doing is useless if it just stays in our filing cabinets or in our computer. If no one's learning from it, there's no point in us doing this. Which means that after each project, we analyze what we find, we create some maps, we fill out some site forms for the state database and for our regional office, and we put together a report. Basically, we just need to put all of our data into some kind of format that someone else can use and build off of. We then share that information with the state and with our tribal partners. We also maintain a database within the National Park Service with all this information, so that, say, if I needed to suddenly leave and somebody were coming in, they wouldn't be starting from scratch or digging through all of my paperwork trying to figure out what we know about certain areas. It should all be there. We'll get more into how we actually interpret the sites in a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at some of the things that we find in the park. So the park currently has 101 documented archaeological sites, but that number is going up almost constantly. As you may expect from a park that's centered around historic bathhouses, we have a lot of archaeological remains that are tied to historic bathhouses. These photos are from an excavation in the basement of the Lamar bathhouse in 2003. So we talked earlier about how a lot of our work is tied to other projects, and that was the case here. This was triggered by a project to stabilize support posts in the basement of the Lamar. Our regional office came in. They didn't have a park archaeologist at this point, so they called in for help. And they dug 4 test units in the basement. 3 of them were 2 by 1 meters, and 1 was 1 by 1 meter. So you're looking at, 7 square yards, something like that. In that space, they found over 4,500 artifacts and foundation remains from 2 previous structures. But that wasn't really unexpected, given the history of Bathhouse Row. We knew that at least 2 buildings had been on the spot prior. And if you go into the basement of most of the bathhouses and look really closely, you can see portions of old foundations worked in. In fact, each bathhouse on the row is its own archaeological site. This is just a close-up of one of those foundations because it's really hard to see this photo since it's very dark. I just lost light, so let me make sure that this is working. Okay. All right. Another type of resource we have in the park are novaculite quarries. Now, if you're from here, you have probably heard about novaculite. It's a type of stone with a really high silica content that's only found in a couple places in the whole world. This is one of 3. Its name actually comes from a Latin word meaning razor stone. And these quarries are one of our most significant archaeological resources in the park. We have both prehistoric and historic quarries in the park, dating back over 10,000 years. People were coming to the Ouachita Mountains to get this stone because it breaks in a really predictable way and it's easy to get it really sharp. So not only were they coming and quarrying it for themselves, they also were using it as a trade good. We find novaculite from this area all over the region. It's been found at Poverty Point, Louisiana. I haven't seen this confirmed in any site forms or reports, but I have heard that it's been found as far north as Illinois. It's making its way all over the place. After the Civil War, settlers in the region also were mining novaculite here, using it mainly for whetstones, although in more recent times it's been used for nail files, additives to adhesives, even as an ingredient in Pyrex. So I think this goes without saying, but there are no active mines in the park anymore. All of them are long shut down. And what you see here are one quarry pit. That's the bigger photo. You have a novaculite face that's been quarried out. You can see where it's kind of indented there. And then that bottom photo is just debris around a quarry. That's what was left behind after somebody had worked there. Kind of tied to those novaculite quarries, we get a type of site that we just call lithic scatters. And that's not just us calling it that, that's a standard term. These are basically a cluster of stone artifacts without any other features. There's no fire pits, there's no post holes. It's just the stone artifacts. This could be left over from a short-term campsite or even just a place somebody was sitting and, using that stone they just quarried to turn it into a tool. We find occasional tools like the projectile point you see up there, but for the most part, we're finding just leftovers from making tools. It's called debitage, which is a very fun word to say. And as you can see here, this novaculite comes in all kinds of different colors, which makes it extra fun. We do have a few Native American habitation sites in the park. We don't have any structures, but even without structures left, we can tell the difference based on the kinds of artifacts we're finding. And a lot of this really boils down to common sense. So when I tell you, you're going to say, well, duh. People don't want to carry big, heavy things around. They don't want to carry big, fragile ceramic pots or 50-pound grinding stones. If they're making those things, they want to stay in one place for a while. You also may find tools associated with agriculture. And again, there's no point in having tools for agriculture if you're not going to be in one place long enough to use them. So Euro-Americans settled Hot Springs in the early 1800s, and the area has been pretty densely occupied ever since. That means we have historic homesteads all throughout the park. We find things like foundations, concrete pads, garden terraces, cisterns, fences, and then all kinds of stuff associated with them. One side note for your safety. If you ever come across an old homestead like this, be very, very careful where you step. There may be open wells or cisterns that are unmarked, and they can be really sneaky. I actually almost fell in the one you can see here up on the top a couple weeks back. It was under a piece of scrap metal, and luckily I moved it before I stepped on it. So standing structures aren't really my field. They're only mine to deal with after they fall down. That being said, things associated with those structures are still archaeology. If your house is more than 50 years old and you find things in your yard from when it was built, you live in the middle of an archaeological site. Congratulations. We use that 50 years as a cutoff, which means a 1960s homestead also now qualifies as a site. But just because something counts as an archaeological site doesn't mean it's something that's important enough to save. We talk about a site's importance by talking about its eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. So there are set criteria a site has to meet in order for us to really, really worry about preserving it. It needs to retain its integrity, which means it needs to be in good shape. You know, if there used to be a structure there, but it's completely gone, there's nothing left of it, and somebody has plowed the whole area, it no longer retains its integrity. And then it has to either be associated with an important person, an important event, it has to have some kind of unique characteristics, or it has to be able to tell us more about history. It has to provide some new information. So what you see on this slide, or the cistern I already mentioned, you can see a set of stairs here hiding in this yucca. And if you look really closely at this slide, or this photo over here, you can see remainders of a stone foundation, along with some artifacts. All right, so where did the people living in these houses put their trash? Well, the real answer is wherever they wanted. There weren't really landfills, you know. So that means there are dump sites all throughout the woods, dating from the 1800s up through modern times. Although for archaeological purposes, we only care about the ones prior to 1971. Unfortunately, some people just still haven't figured out how to properly dispose of their trash. The sites have the things you would expect to see in a dump. Bottles, cans, jars, broken plates, toys, anything and everything people would be throwing away. So this might seem really boring, but you can learn a lot about people from their trash. And no, I'm not recommending that you go dig through your crush's trash can. Please don't do that. You can learn what they eat, what kinds of things they wear, what kinds of personal care products they're going to use. Do they spend a lot of money on personal care, or do they spend a lot of money on food, or do they not spend a lot of money on either? It gives us a really good chance to learn about actual day-to-day lives of actual people. And this is especially helpful if you can tie it to a specific community. Say you have, for example, a Reconstruction era African American community. You can learn all of these things about how they were actually living, and then compare that to other places and see if there are things that were unique to that community. And then there's the other category. These are all different kinds of sites that just don't really fit into a box. So this photo all the way on the left is one of my favorite ridiculous things from the park. This is an old shooting gallery. And all of those little white dots you see are bottles that somebody climbed up there and set up by hand. As you can imagine, they didn't go pick up every piece of glass after, because they would have also had to do that by hand. So what we have left is just a pile of bottles that have been shot. We also have things like an abandoned silver mine that never actually produced any silver. Our campground is technically an archaeological site. There used to be cabins there before the park bought it. They are no longer there, but again, some of the remains that would have gone along with that would be. You have things like the Fordyce Estate, the railroad berm we mentioned earlier, the hot cave in the Hale, cemeteries, all kinds of different things. And all of them are just things that are made or used by people. All right, so we've located a new site. We've documented what we found there. So how do we take all of these bottles or these little bits of rock and turn them into something meaningful, something that we can actually use? So I mentioned earlier that this is sort of a puzzle. Everything we find on site gives us a little bit of the picture, and we just have to put it together to see the whole thing. If we have, for example, a site where we find a whole bunch of ink bottles, mineral water bottles, wine bottles, but we're not seeing any cosmetics jars or any plates, we may be looking at the remains of a business instead of a house. Things like that, where we take the whole assemblage that we're looking at and try to learn what we're actually seeing. So once we have an idea of what's going on at that individual site level, it's also important to put it into a bigger context so that we can see big picture trends across the whole landscape. And to do that, we need to know when a site was in use. Dating a site is one of the single most important steps in the entire archaeological process. Now, we could spend a whole hour or more talking about different ways that archaeologists date sites. There are people who are far smarter than I am who do things like measure the breakdown in carbon-14. There are people who have spent their whole career building a chronology of tree rings for a region. So if you find a piece of wood, you can send it to them and they'll look at their chronology and say, okay, yours matches up right here. So your piece of wood that you sent me dates from 1405 AD. There's a way that you can measure the amount of water that was absorbed by a piece of obsidian, like all kinds of different things. But as I said, those are all being done by people who are far smarter than I am, which means it's really expensive. And you're limited to certain materials. You can't carbon date a site if you don't have carbon. So what we actually tend to use on a day-to-day basis is something called artifact seriation. And that's just a fancy way to say that styles change over time. I'm sure that you guys have seen different Coke bottles from different time periods and the way that those have changed. And there would be people who could look at those and tell you exactly when those Coke bottles came from. That's the kind of thing that we're really looking for. So there's certain kinds of artifacts that we have really good dates for. And if we find those, we can use them to date the site. So say, for example, you have 8 different places in a region where you find projectile points. So arrowheads, dart points, something along those lines. You have 8 projectile points that are very, very similar. And people have dated those at those sites using all of those other different methods and ended up with a very similar range. We know that that type of projectile point then came from that time frame. So then if I find one of those on my site, I can say, okay, this is like these 8 other projectile points that have been dated using other methods. So I know that my site dates to that same time frame. The chart you're looking at on your screen is what's called a battleship curve, and it's just kind of the sciencey way to explain that. It's just a way to look at different styles on different sites and how they develop over time. So the problem is that the artifacts we can use to date things are usually the pretty ones. They're the ones people want to take home with them. Prehistoric sites especially, we're looking for things like projectile points. So again, that would be your arrowheads, dart points, spear points. We're looking for ceramics, artistic things that would be left over, beads, that kind of thing. And if people take those things, we lose our ability to date a lot of these sites and our chance to put them in the bigger context, which means that no matter how much we learn about that site at an individual level, it's not going to teach us everything it could have taught us about history. And that's why laws like the Archaeological Resources Protection Act exist, to protect sites and the information and make sure that we're not losing that chance to learn. That's also why we constantly remind people to leave things where they find them. So one side note, since I just threw a lot of sciencey jargon at you, the person who came up with the idea of seriation, his name was Sir William Flinders Petrie. And apart from his brilliant archaeological methods, he's best known for excavating in a tutu and living in a tomb in Egypt because he wanted people to leave him alone. So why is this important? Why do we care if we can't date these sites? Why do we care if none of this works out the way we want it to? Archaeology helps us understand history from times when there are no written records or from times where there's only kind of one-sided written records. It really can help us understand history from the perspective of underrepresented groups. Things like, what would day-to-day life be like for a poor illiterate farmer in the 1800s? What would life have been like for a woman who was working at a boarding house? And then also bigger picture questions, things like, what kinds of African cultural and religious traditions survived transatlantic slavery? It gives a voice to people who traditionally have been voiceless in the historical record and can help us get a more well-rounded view of the world. Additionally, I'm sure at least some of you have heard the old adage that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So if we don't understand how things happened in the past, then it's harder for us to avoid making the same mistakes. Things like, if we don't understand how ancient Egypt maintained diplomatic power in such a large region for such a long time, how can we use those strategies? They may have been doing something in a way that we would never think of doing, and it may be something that would be really productive for us. Additionally, archaeological sites are a non-renewable resource. When they're gone, and we have any chance we had to learn from them are gone with them. And that's why it's so important to leave sites the way you find them. As we in the Park Service say, take only memories and leave only footprints. All right, I know I just threw a lot at you. So does anybody have any questions, comments, anything you would like me to explain a little bit better?
Well, in response to your explanation of why it's so important to protect these sites, Joanne said, "Love that," and I agree. That was I can tell you're very passionate about this.
A little bit.
And on that note, if anyone has any, this is a final call for questions and comments. Joanne had a comment that said, "I found a novaculite artifact in Illinois last week."
Ooh. Woohoo!
So one of the questions I had, you covered quite a bit. I could tell you had more you could have said on the topic, and that was how to determine if an artifact or an object is 50 years old or older. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything else to add to that?
Well, that could be an entire university course. So it depends on what kind of artifact you're looking at. In this area, if you're finding Native American artifacts, it's a pretty safe assumption that they are going to be older than 50 years. There are things you can look for with bottles that'll tell you their age, can styles. Really, it's just learning the artifacts and learning what you should be looking for with them. Sometimes things are really nice. I mean, some bottles have the date stamped on them, and then it's a really easy answer. But
so would you say there's a big difference between dating the site itself versus the artifacts you might find there?
Sort of. They go hand in hand. So we use those artifacts in the site that we can date the actual site. And that can get a little tricky. Sometimes people are picking things up and bringing them in. We're humans. Everyone collects things. I mean, we have evidence from ancient Assyria of a king there making a museum. So if somebody were to dig just one thing up from that, they would probably misdate a site. But when you have a whole artifact assemblage and you have, 100 bottles that are all from the same date range, it's pretty safe to say that site is from that date.
Makes sense. And you kind of covered this one too. If someone finds an object, what do they do?
Well, if you're in the park, the best thing you can do, and this is best case scenario, and I know this is a lot to ask, take a photo, a GPS point if you can. I mean, Google Maps and things like that will let you take a GPS point at this point, and then just report it to somebody in the park and they'll send it my way.
What if they find something offsite?
Offsite, you can still contact us and we can get you in touch with whoever, if you're curious about it, we'll help you out with that. If you would like the state to come in and actually analyze it for you, the state runs a really, really great archaeology program through the University of Arkansas. And so we can get you in touch with them as well.
Are there a lot of debates and disputes over who has the right or the ownership over something they find?
Not at all. That's a huge misconception. So pretty much anywhere in the U.S., and when I say pretty much anywhere in the U.S., if you're a private landowner and you have something on your land, you own that. The only kind of exception to that are graves. And that's going to vary by state. Arkansas actually has pretty strict rules about graves and disturbing them. So, that's generally most people aren't going to disturb someone's grave anyway. So that's kind of
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So what is the question that you would say you get asked the most in your position?
You've asked a lot of them, honestly. The what to do question comes up a lot. I get asked about things I found and places I work, what's the coolest thing you've ever found? Things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is the coolest thing you've ever found?
I found a carved ivory spoon in Israel that was from the Islamic period. That was pretty ornate and pretty cool.
Wow. Do you have any kind of horror stories about someone coming to you with an artifact, but they pretty much destroyed it because they moved it?
Not me specifically. I did witness at one point somebody actually bring in human remains in a Walmart bag and hand it to somebody, which please don't bring human remains into somewhere with a Walmart bag. But that was probably the worst thing I've seen as far as.
Right. That ties into disturbing grave sites too.
Exactly.
Are there any good documentaries or books that you would recommend for people who want to learn more?
You know, it really depends on what specifically they want to learn about. You know, archaeology is a huge field with a lot of different subfields. I mean, like we touched on a few of the many, many, many different things you could do today. I would say contact me. I had my email address on that last slide, I think, so we can throw that back up. And let me know what you're interested in, and I can send people like individual recommendations.
Excellent. Nice comment from Joanne, who says Victoria is a great addition and asset to Hot Springs.
Oh, well, thank you.
All right. Oops. Do you have any final remarks you would like to share? Or before you do that, how about you share one more piece of trivia or an interesting story with us in your experience?
Well, as most archaeologists who have worked on any kind of bigger scale site can tell you, nothing good ever shows up until the last day when you're trying to close everything up. So I was working in Ecuador. This was as part of college. I was there as kind of student staff. And the last week we were working, we had been finding nothing. And one of the local guys that was working with us goes, "Hey, you know there's an Inca kitchen down the hill, right?" We all just kind of stopped and looked at each other and followed him down the hill. And he was like, "Yeah, we were trying to plant something here a while back and then stopped because we started finding ash and things." We opened up a unit there. Sure enough, we found, we don't think it was Inca, we think it was Karanki, but, you know, a floor, kitchen floor, whole pot, lots of obsidian artifacts, and we had a week to deal with it.
Wow. All right. Are there any upcoming events you're able to share at this time?
Absolutely. The park is hosting Junior Ranger Jamboree / Archaeology Day on October 16th. You know, keep your eyes open. That may change depending on how COVID goes, but we should have lots of great partners there, lots of great activities for kids, and it'll just be a great time.
Excellent. All right, now I'll give you a chance if there's any final remarks.
I don't think I have anything else. I mean, I just appreciate everyone being here today and appreciate you all for letting me come talk to you.
Absolutely. Right back at you. And thank you everyone for watching. And as always, if you enjoyed this or you tuned in late, this has been recorded, so you can share it on Facebook or YouTube and let people find out more information about archaeology in general and in our area. And they can reach out to Victoria at this email address on the screen with more questions and comments. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching, and thank you, Ranger Reichard.
Thank you.